More than 60 years ago, in a seaside town in California, something strange happened. The residents of the town woke up one fine morning to find thousands of seabirds diving towards their homes and their cars, and many of them came crashing against the walls of their houses and window panes. And just before many of these birds fell down, half-eaten fish and algae fell right out of their mouths. A very famous movie director called Alfred Hitchcock was inspired by this event, and he also made a movie called The Birds. It took scientists more than 50 years to figure out why these seabirds had lost their way and why did they dive bomb into cars and homes. Scientists guessed that some kind of poisoning had entered the food chain of birds and had traveled right up to these seabirds and possibly affected their brains. In today's episode, we talk about how each one of us can help create a world that is safer for birds. And that is by participating in a joyous 4-day event called the Great Backyard Bird Count, during which people from anywhere in the world can go right out into their backyards or take a stroll near a forest or a marshland near where you live and record what birds we see and update them in a database that scientists from around the world can use. This episode is part 2 of a 2-part podcast series on the Great Backyard Bird Count, or the GBBC as it's called. Hi there, you're listening to What's New Today, a kids and family podcast about current events shaping our world. This is Sangeeta, your host from India, and in today's episode, I'm joined by 3 super curious children from different parts of the world and one very curious adult who also happens to play a very important part in the Great Backyard Bird Count. So let me introduce you to my co-host for today.
Hi, my name is Shravan. I'm from Singapore and I'm 9 years old.
Hi, my name is Tanvi. I'm from Columbus, Ohio. I'm 10 years old.
Hi, my name is Adya. I'm from India and I'm 11 years old.
Hi, I am Becca Rodomsky Bish, and I live outside of Ithaca, New York in the United States. I work at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and I am the project leader for the Great Backyard Bird Count.
Welcome all of you to this show. Let's dive right into some of the questions kids have written in about birds in general, but there are some specific questions that Becca might be able to help us about how to participate in the GBBC. And here's the first question. Hi, I'd like to participate in the GBBC, but if I did see a bird out in my backyard and if I did not know what bird it was, how do I identify that bird? I know Tanvi, Shravan and Adya have tried identifying birds using some apps. What do you think these kids could do?
We go to a bird app like eBird or Merlin Bird and just show upload the photo there. They'll tell you exactly which bird it is.
I used a Merlin app this morning and I was describing the crow. It was sparrow size. It was like a brownish color. And then it came that it was a Eurasian tree sparrow. If you're describing it, it'll be correct.
So at school, we used an app called iNaturalist. Our teacher said it was like a giant science community where you just upload a picture of an animal and it'll tell you like the species.
Wow.
All of this sounds really interesting. Becca, how do you go about it?
So the way that I learned how to identify birds was actually using a bird ID book. Before Merlin existed and before iNaturalist existed, when I was getting into birds about more than 20 years ago, that's what I used. I used a bird ID book for my area, and I would look it up based on the color and the size of the bird, just like Merlin helps you walk through. And that's how I originally learned how to ID books. And those still exist. And sometimes what's nice about those books is that they're specific to regions. So you don't get every possible bird imaginable, right? You can get birds very close to where you are residing. And then in terms of entering the data, so people that are IDing birds in Merlin, when they get to sort of the end of their workflow, and usually Merlin will give you a handful of options about what possible bird you're seeing. If you click, "This is my bird," that counts as participation in the Great Backyard Bird Count. So you only really need to ID one bird, walk through the Merlin workflow once, and you've participated in the Great Backyard Bird Count. Now, you can't tell us how many you saw. So a lot of people get excited to say, I saw 10 Eurasian tree sparrows and I want to tell you about all 10. So if you want to tell us the numbers, using the eBird app is the other option. And there's a phone version of that, or there's an online computer version of it. Similar, you walk through questions, you tell us where you are, when you saw the bird, time, and so forth. And then you can enter the bird and the number of that bird that you saw.
How do you count the number of birds if they're in a flock?
I love that you're asking that question. That's a pretty mature bird watching question. Not everybody thinks about that because flocks are tricky to count. What I tell people to do is, depending on whether you're looking at them with your own just eyes or whether you're looking at them in a binocular, whatever your vision is, I tell people to kind of break that line of vision up into 4 quadrants. So almost like you're making a piece of pie, and count the amount of birds in just one of those 4 quadrants. So maybe you count 20, and then you multiply that number by 4, right? So 20 by 4, 80. And we realize at the people on the Cornell Lab end of the tools realize that people are making estimates about flocks. And so we have sort of our own ability to massage that data a little bit and know that some of the bigger flock numbers that people enter are estimates, and that's a-okay. We're not asking for exact precision, just sort of a general count is the best way to go there.
So how do you know that you're not counting the same bird twice?
Great question. You don't always know, especially if you're counting birds from your bird feeders, because I think Tanvi says she's in Ohio. You probably have black-capped chickadees where you are, which I have in my feeders, and they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And you're just counting as many of those species that you see in the 15 or 20 or hour, however long you're watching your birds. And it's okay if you are counting the same bird more than once. You're just recording how many times you saw that type of bird in the window of time that you're watching. And again, when we download this data, as the scientists use this data, they realize that there will be redundancy in some of the birds based on area, based on just people who are reporting birds. And so they can weave in sort of changes to their mathematical analysis to account for possible redundancies.
Those were some really thoughtful questions about how to enter the information once you've counted all the birds in your backyard. Now, I've got another question from a 7-year-old listener who's written in. What would happen to the world if there were no birds at all?
Well, for the start, the food chain would collapse. Insects would crawl up and get it too much in number, and all the animals and plants would die.
There would be no protein for us. Eggs gave us proteins.
So actually, things that birds eat would become invasive, and things that eat birds would become endangered because they wouldn't have enough food source, or if they eat other things, they would go after the other things they eat more, and the other things they eat would become endangered.
I love how scientific all of your minds are, because when you asked this question, the first thing that my mind went to was, what a boring world. No songs, no bird songs, no beautiful plumage and colors flitting around. So my mind, even though I'm technically considered the scientist, my mind went to just, life wouldn't be as colorful or sound as fun without birds. So you all are ahead of me with the science. But no, I agree. There would be definitely collapse of certain food chains for sure. We would definitely have an overabundance of insects because there's many birds that consume insects, and that's actually one of the reasons why many animal populations are decreasing right now, unfortunately, and birds and insects are one of those. And we're seeing those declines going down at the same time. Man, I don't want to live in a world without birds myself. I don't know about you all.
Neither would I. It would be a really drab world. And here's a third question, and this is about how we feed birds. Many of us have seen people feed birds. They may even have bird feeders in their gardens. Do you think feeding birds in your gardens is a good idea or perhaps not?
Well, I think it's actually a very good thing because if you feed the birds, then they'll be able to lay more eggs and they'll get more food without having to worry about their mate and their eggs.
I think it could be both good or bad because actually when I get bird feeder bags, the big bags of bird food, on the back it has the species that like or eat that kind of bird food. If another kind of bird eats it, then what would happen?
Sometimes in India they put rice for the some mostly crows, but sometimes other birds come and eat it. I mean, the crows can find their own food, but
And so by feeding all those crows, we help the crow population stay stable. Is that right? So, Becca, I've long been feeding birds in my own backyard, but I've heard very conflicting views about whether this is a good practice or not. So, is there a right or a wrong way to go about this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and all of your ideas are excellent. And it's a question that a lot of scientists have been asking too, especially in the United States and Canada, where a lot of people feed birds. And perhaps that is true where you all are calling in from too. So here is the short answer. There's no scientific research that we've been able to point to yet that says it's bad for birds. But there's also not overwhelming evidence that we can point to that says it's good for birds. So it's one of those things that it just seems like it kind of has a neutral effect. And so the one potential dangerous thing about feeding birds is that diseases can be passed at bird feeders sometimes. And so if there's outbreaks of disease that could be transmitted on bird feeders, that's where we have to be cautious and we have to take our feeders down pretty quickly, soap, water, clean them, make sure they're very clean and not put them back up until the signs are past that the birds are not struggling with that illness anymore. So that's the one reason why bird feeders can be dangerous, literally, that we've been able to point to. But in terms of providing the food, it seems like it's an okay thing to do. It's not necessarily helping birds, but it's also not hurting birds in terms of providing food itself for them.
That's a really interesting learning. All right, one last question from my side. If you acquired some magical superpower by which, you could turn yourself into a bird, which one of these two would you prefer? Would you prefer being a migratory bird, travel long distances, see new places and meet new birds, but you may or may not find food easily? Or would you rather be one of those birds that usually stays in just one place where you're reasonably assured of your food supply?
this is a hard question because I like staying in one place, but I also want to go see around the world. But do I have to be on top of the bird or can I just be the bird?
Yeah, either option works.
So I'll rather sit on top of the bird because I want to see the entire world. And if I become a migratory bird, non-migratory bird, the ones that don't migrate, just stay in one place. The one place I would stay in would be probably the US because it has a lot of food.
A lot of food.
Yeah,
So there are a lot of terms and conditions attached to your choice.
yeah.
Tanvi?
I think I'd stay in one place because I'd rather have something easy. And like Shravan said, in the US, they have more protection for birds. So, yeah, I just live in a bush or a tree near a bird feeder. That's what the birds that live in my bush do.
Very interesting choice. What about you, Adya?
Okay, now I'm getting conflicted because I like having a steady food source and having like one home, but at the same time I like to explore.
But if you could choose only one?
I choose to be on top of a migratory bird.
An adventure seeker. Becca, do you have a choice?
I would be a migratory bird. I know it's a high risk life. It's treacherous to move from place to place every season, but you get to see a lot more of the world when you're a migratory bird. And it's interesting you all would stay in the United States. You know where I'd go? Straight to the tropics. I'd go to tropical areas. And I know India has a growing population of people that are feeding birds. Birds have become a real, India, I don't know if you all know this, but the United States submitted the most checklists, but India was second last year for the most checklists submitted during GBBC. It was incredible. So there's many places around the world where people love birds and are feeding them, and there's a lot of policies to protect birds.
I have a question for Becca. What will we get if we shoot down birds? I get why they shoot down animals for the flesh. Birds like sparrows or parrots, what do they get from those kind of birds?
It's a very good question. Most birds in the US, it would be illegal to shoot a bird down out of the sky or its environment. And then in terms of eating them, not a whole lot. The birds that are traditionally eaten in the United States are wetland birds. So ducks are sometimes shot and consumed for meat. Turkeys, I was going to say turkeys, Thanksgiving, our traditional Thanksgiving bird. And then, of course, people raise chickens and pheasants for meat. But your sort of average songbird, there just wouldn't be very much meat there to eat.
What's the rarest bird that's ever been recorded in the GBBC?
Wow, that's a really hard question. I'll admit that I've only been managing GBBC for, this will be my 4th year, and it's been going for 26 years. So I can't speak to the years before I was directly involved. But last year, we saw a couple of birds. Mostly these are birds that have gotten off track. They're normal migratory sort of places. So we had a reporting in Canada of a Steller's sea eagle last year that was really exciting. People in different parts of Canada, down into parts of North America, the United States, Maine, were able to see this bird. And this bird is normally found on the coastal areas in Japan and in North Korea and Mongolia and Russia. So it was way far away from places that it was normally seen. And this does happen for birds. Sometimes birds just get off their roots or they decide, like you all were talking about, maybe they're just going to go someplace else and try another area and see what they can see. So birds sometimes do that too. And that sighting last year was very exciting for people in Canada and the United States to be able to see a bird that normally you'd have to get on an airplane and fly really far away to be able to catch a glimpse of.
On that very exciting note that we could all sight some really rare birds during our great backyard bird count, it's a great opportunity for all of us to step out of our homes anytime during those 4 days, February 17th to 20th, for even as short an interval as just 15 minutes. Note down what birds you see and upload them in the database. If you'd like to know links to which apps you can download to be able to record your observations, we've left links to these in the show notes below. And thanks all of you for being such a wonderful part of today's conversation, and a very big special thanks to Becca for being such a great sport and answering several of these offbeat questions.
Wonderful to meet you all. I loved it.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. If you enjoyed this banter between Shravan, Tanvi, Adya, Becca and I, you just might find What's New Today podcast channel one of the easiest and the most fun-filled ways of catching up on interesting news stories around the world. New episodes drop every Monday and Friday. Please do click the follow and subscribe button wherever you're listening to this podcast. And while you're at it, could we also request you to leave us a rating and a review? That really helps us grow our listener base. Have a great day and thanks for listening.